History Town was brought to you by...
It's 1862. You are hand-digging through layers of frustrating gravel, hoping and praying the next shovel stroke will expose a fortune in gold. Everyone says it's crazy, but there's too much at stake. Then, just when the outcome seems impossibly bleak, the ground begins to pay. The lead is struck, and the greatest creekside placer gold deposit the world has ever seen is suddenly yours for the taking. This is Barkerville's story.
For more information, visit barkerville.ca. Barkerville, a National Historic Site of Canada.
You found History Town.
You found History Town.
You found History Town.
You found History Town.
Hey, you found History Town. Nice one.
Good day, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the History Town podcast. I am your host. My name is Matthew Quick, and on today's episode, we'll be catching up with James Douglas, and also we'll have a very special guest, a very short but sweet interview with Dave Brown. Now, as always, this is a listener-supported podcast, so I ask you if you could share, like, retweet, rate, do whatever you can to help us support. If you like this podcast, please try to get it out to all of your friends. Also, if you know anyone who is an interpreter or historian or anybody you think should be on the show, or if you'd like to get a hold of us here at History Town, you can reach me at Twitter at history_town. You can also email us at info@historytown.ca or directly to me at matt@historytown.ca. I'd love to hear from you. Now, before we get started to talk with Dave Brown, I'd like to check in with my old friend there with James Douglas in Barkerville. If you're new to the podcast, James Douglas is the manager of visitor experiences in Barkerville. He's also an old friend of mine. Last week, we were talking about him arriving to Wells, and now we're about to enter into the conversation of actually walking into the park of Barkerville for the first time. Welcome back to episode 3 to History Town, and I would also like to welcome back a great guy, my friend and yours. He is the manager of visitor experiences in Barkerville Historic Town Park, and that is James Douglas.
Hello, Matt.
How are you today?
I am great.
Oh, I know you're always great. You're in Barkerville.
That's true, actually.
There is no crying in Barkerville.
No crying in Barkerville.
Now, last week, we talked about entering into Wells, where we left off. A young James Douglas in 1998 at this time.
That is correct.
Heading into Wells. Now, I'd like to continue on with your story. So, do you remember where you first lived in Wells? Did you have roommates?
I did. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you there.
No.
Yeah, I did. It was my friend Charles Ross, who, for those listening last week, will know, was a friend of mine that I went to university with, who had been coming up to Barkerville for a few years and convinced me in the summer of 1998 to come join him, working for Dave Brown, Mr. Grimsby, on the waterwheel. And so Charlie and I lived together at the Wells Apartments, number 44.
You remember the number?
Oh, I do indeed. Yes. Nice little corner place. Still there. I don't know who's living in it now, but those apartments in Wells, to try to describe it, it's a large sort of circular block of 1, 2, and 3 bedroom apartments that have a large grass courtyard on the inside. They were built in the 1940s. On top of mine tailings, if you can believe it. In the 1930s, when the Cariboo Gold Quartz mine was in full operation, the lake side of what is now Jack of Clubs Lake actually went right up and touched where the highway currently runs. Really? So between 1933 and the mid-1940s, as they were pulling rock out of the deep shaft mines, they were doing hard rock mining. So going in, ripping out all of the material, including the quartz that had the gold in it, and then doing a mercury amalgamation process once they'd broken the rock all down to pour gold bricks. But that, of course, leaves a lot of waste rock because you're digging underground. It's an underground drilling program and these tunnels are stretching for kilometers at a time. So all of the rock that comes out while they're drilling is called tailings, and they pile all of that up in and around the mine. And so this lake, Jack of Clubs Lake, the shoreline began to change over that decade as they just poured thousands and thousands of tons of waste rock along the shoreline. So ultimately, these tailings piles became so large and so solid that you could build on top of them. And so in the 1940s, these apartments got built up over top of the mine tailings, and they were used as barracks basically for for the guys working at the mine, and they would live in communal situations as well. They're really huge, these apartments, totally made out of concrete and plaster, and it's a really interesting experience to live in them and to really feel the history there. You really can't help it. It's all around you.
And they're durable, that's for sure. I mean, I my first year I lived in a 1-bedroom with my girlfriend at the time, and I remember going up the stairs, and they are just concrete. Like,
oh yeah,
they are. If you fall down those stairs, like, good luck. you're on your own.
That's true.
So let's start with you're in Wells.
Mm-hmm.
Now you're taking that 8-kilometer drive. Did you drive in your first time into Barkerville?
Yes. Charlie had, I don't remember the make, but it was a brown station wagon that we had driven up from Vernon. We stayed over with my mom for a night before we drove up to Wells. And then took his brown station wagon up to Wells, got settled in our apartments, and then the very next day drove into Barkerville for me to meet Dave Brown for the very first time, which was very strange. In an acting gig, you usually meet the guy who's your boss long before you show up for your first day of work. But because of the nature of how it all happened, I only interviewed with Dave over the phone from Victoria. And you know Dave Brown, and I think our listeners at some point will also get to know Dave Brown, and he's got a very distinctive voice.
Yes, he does.
So I had oh, sorry, yeah.
I was going to say, he's also, if you look at most advertising by Barkerville, you may notice a big bearded, or not a big bearded fellow, but a big bearded, has a big beard, I should say. I'm trying to say this correctly. Fellow who on the front, who a lot of people call Billy Barker.
Right.
But he's not Billy Barker. He is Mr. Grimsby.
Mr. Grimsby.
Played by Dave Brown. But if you see him, he is, he stands out. He stands out as like a miner.
He really does. He absolutely does. He exudes authenticity for sure. But it's funny because based just solely on his voice, I had a very different picture of what Dave would look like in my mind. He certainly did not disappoint. But it was very interesting to meet him for the first time. Now, just as an addendum to this story, Dave Brown is a very, very good friend of mine now. He was the best man at my wedding. So I'm not in any way trying to suggest that he was scary or anything, but I was nervous, meeting my boss for the first time and coming to this place that I'd never been to before, but had created all of these memories in my mind just based on the stories of my friends who had spent some time up here in the summer. So I was a little nervous coming in to the park for the first time, for sure.
What was your first thoughts as you entered into the park and saw St. Saviour's and other buildings along the side?
Because as you know, again, Matt, we come at St. Saviour's in the opposite direction that the miners in the 1870s would have. They came down through Chinatown first, and St. Saviour's was at the end of the road, and it was meant to sort of be your lodestone as a good Victorian Anglican. But now, because of the development of Wells, we come at Barkerville from the opposite side. So at first, when I first went through the Visitors Reception Center and sort of saw the back end of the church and saw a few little buildings around, it was a very comfortable feeling in that, I'd seen that sort of set up in a heritage site before. I grew up in Vernon, very close to O'Keefe Ranch, spent a lot of time there growing up. So it seemed very familiar. What I was not prepared for was what I was going to see once I rounded the corner around St. Saviour's Church and just was able to look all the way up that near 3/4 of a mile stretch of frontier town. And the two things that struck me were how huge the site was. I was not prepared for how big of a town it really is in the middle of the woods on top of a mountain or at the foothills of a mountain. But the second thing was, and, I'm not a huge deja vu kind of person, or I'm not a huge believer in prescience of any kind. But honest to God, I feel like I felt at that time as though I had been here before. And maybe it's because when I was studying Barkerville in grade 5 or grade 10, I saw enough photographs of the front street of town, historical photographs, to have that floating around in the back of my head somewhere. So when I saw it, I did instantly recognize it, but that's not how I felt. I felt like I have been here before, even though I never had. So that was a very interesting introduction to this place that would ultimately, in some fashion, consume my professional life. I just felt this is an incredible feeling. I really do feel like I felt in Wells. I feel like I'm home. And so what I knew pretty much instantly, what I had initially expected to be just a 2-month love affair with a beautiful, pristine place in the middle of the wilderness, became a lifelong obsession that day.
Well, you think it's going to be a fling with Barkerville, and some people it is. Some people it's,
sure.
It's a nice little summer romance, and for others, it's a relationship. It's and now that was in 98. You were the character you portrayed was Mr. Crookshank?
Nigel Crookshank, yes.
Nigel Crookshank. I remember that from our first talk. Now, what was it like to put on those boots, strap it all on, and then head out into that park? That first day as an interpreter.
It was very exciting. A little bit nerve-wracking, too, because at that time in particular, Dave Brown, who was our employer on the waterwheel, employed a tried-and-true method of street performance rehearsal, which was basically I knew that I was going to be responsible to be one half of this mining demonstration duo. And it's a fairly complex presentation. It's a 45-minute presentation that deals with the inner workings of deep shaft mining and the way that the water wheel operates. There was also a second presentation, which was basically the history of the gold rush from California up to Cariboo. And so there was a lot of material, and there were no scripts, no written scripts at all.
Really?
Yeah, no, basically we watched the show for a few days and then, rehearsed lines with each other in between.
Wow.
But after about 3 days, I was expected to get up and just do the presentation with Dave or with Charlie. And that was very nerve-wracking, but it was an excellent way to get a crash course in this kind of performance, as well as the information that you just need to remember. So it etches itself into your brain, because the panic ensuing that if I don't get this right, and there are people who've been coming to Barkerville for years, they'll know if I don't get this right. So it was a full on just headfirst dive into a whole new way of looking at putting up theater presentations. So it was spectacular. And the boots, it's funny that you mentioned boots, because I had brought with me a pair of 1950s motorcycle boots that I had acquired from the Powerhouse Theater in Vernon, where I had done a number of community theater presentations. They really just looked like, they didn't look modern at all. They looked like Victorian working boots, but they were
Waterproof?
Not really, no. They were leather and knee high, so the laces went right up.
Oh, wow.
Right up to just under my knee. And so we're very well supported. Like my ankles were very well supported, which turned out to be a real blessing when you're walking around on gravel all day long. Yeah. But it was nice. It was a nice way to bring a piece of my previous theater experience into this very new realm of performance. Gave me a lot of comfort. And then the costume just kind of took off from there.
Your wedding, and I think I really want to hear it, because you had a Barkerville wedding. Is that not?
Well, actually, no.
You did not have I thought you got married in Barkerville.
No, we got married in Wells. We got married at the Wells Community Hall because we didn't, as much as we love Barkerville, we felt getting married in Barkerville and having a full costumed wedding, like so many of our family members expected us to do, would be kind of like working at Tim Hortons and getting married at Tim Hortons in your Tim Hortons uniform. And and I don't mean to try and disparage anybody who works at Tim Hortons. I love the franchise, to be perfectly honest, and I love Barkerville. But we just felt for us, what we wanted to do was still share our love of the place, but use it as an opportunity to show off Wells to our family and friends. And so we did the whole thing, the whole ceremony, the reception, everything at the Wells Community Hall, which is a historic building in its own right. And we did have a little bit of Barkerville in it, however. Not only did a number of the Barkerville cast from that day do some presentations and performances at the wedding, including a solid gold dance.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it was a lot of fun. But also the Lung Duck Tong Chinese restaurant from Barkerville catered the wedding. So we had some of the best pieces of Barkerville there with us that day, for sure. And I mean, Barkerville is a great place to get married. Don't get me wrong. And in fact, 7 years later, we renewed our vows at St. Saviour's Church, which was a really nice opportunity for us. But we do have quite a healthy wedding product here at Barkerville with regards to the kinds of activities that we can provide for people who do want to get married here. And especially now, within the last few years, we've really created some very nice functional spaces, everything from a renovation of the visitors reception center. We're building a new outdoor shelter that will be multi-purpose as well. We really do have upped our game with regards to weddings, so it is a great destination, and I would highly recommend it.
It's actually a lot of people would plan out their weekends with the wedding and then be like, stay in Barkerville for 2 days.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, no, it's a fantastic. And that little, what's this? The church offside of the St. Saviour's?
Yeah, so St. Saviour's Anglican Church is the original St. Saviour's Church, built in 1869. And if you want to get married there, you actually have to contact the Anglican diocese and arrange to have an Anglican ceremony there, because it's one of the 3 buildings in Barkerville that doesn't actually belong to the province of BC. It still belongs to the Anglican Church. But there is the Wesleyan Methodist Church in Barkerville as well, and that's the building that's right beside St. Saviour's. And it's a reconstruction, actually, of the original Wesleyan Methodist Church that was there, which predated St. Saviour's Church, actually. But in this case, it is a building that we use multi-purpose. It's still set up like a church, and we do have weddings in there, certainly. We also do a late afternoon Judge Begbie / Early Justice performance there. Most of the main season Early Justice programming takes place at the courthouse at Richfield, of course, which is a further mile upstream from Barkerville. But we always provide one evening trial reenactment for the guests who come through a little bit later in the day and may not have time to make it all the way up to Barkerville. And it also gives them a really great opportunity to see the kind of makeshift venues that the judges were actually using in the mid to late 1860s, because a lot of the towns that they came into didn't have courthouses at all. So they had to co-opt churches or saloons in some cases, just simply to hold the court proceedings of any given week.
And now we're talking about weddings. Where did you propose? Propose in Barkerville, or did you propose in Wells?
I proposed in Wells. There was a time between 2000 and 2003, I was renting a house just on the sort of northwest corner of Wells near Hardscrabble Road. Really beautiful little old, again, 1940s building that had been renovated over the years. And so Dennett, for the 2 of those 3 years, Dennett lived with me, and it was during that time going into 2001, spring of 2001, April 9th, in fact, 2001. Oh. I proposed to her at our home. We were having a really lovely time together, and it just seemed like the most appropriate thing to do.
And that's actually I did the same thing where me and my wife, we were just having a really nice day, and all of a sudden I was like, and I just blurted out. Also, on a side point, my wife, she asked me if I was going to tell this story because I said I was going to be talking about weddings with you today, and I should probably say it's a funny little sidebar. I don't know if I'll use it or not, but when I was about to propose for my wife, she told me one day she loves emeralds. I was like, perfect. Emeralds in the brain, emeralds. I'm coming home from a Seattle Mariners game on the Clipper in Victoria, and I see a sign for the Jade store. And I'm like, Genevieve loves jade. Because, I don't know, emerald's green, jade's green. I just thought so. So I saved up all this money, and I went put a deposit down on a ring at the Jade store, thinking, I'm the smoothest guy you ever know. That's it. I got it down. I'm going to surprise her. Luckily, before I made the full payment and actually took the ring out, I said, hey, you want to go check out the Jade store? She's like, no. And I'm like, well, what do you mean? She's like, I don't want to go to the Jade store. I'm like, but you love jade. She's like, I like emeralds. And immediately a rush of panic flooded my body. And I confessed to her at that point. I waited an hour because not only would she'd appreciate it, but she also, I mean, there was money on the line. My wife would probably be like, wait a second, what? But I went, I have to go do something. And we took that money and turned it into a trip. And She was going to do a bike ride from Victoria to San Francisco, pedal bike. And I picked her up a $5 jade ring to put on her hand as like a little nice reminder, and also for if anybody at a truck stop sees her, they could be like, oh, she's married, or I would try hitting on her in my own secret way. But also as like a nice in-joke to the fact of my stupidity when I went to ask to propose to my wife. So I just wanted to share that little story, just because yours sounded really sweet, and I was like, I bet you didn't do this. We'll be catching up with James Douglas again next week. However, before I begin the interview with Dave Brown, here's a word from our sponsor.
If you've never been to the end of the road, you can't really describe the experience of having been there. And if you could go to the end of the road only to find what was, over 150 years ago, its own end of the road from the opposite direction, what would you think of that? Discover Barkerville Historic Town. Visit Barkerville.
For more information, visit barkerville.ca. Barkerville, a National Historic Site of Canada.
My next guest is Dave Brown. Now, Dave Brown has been a contract holder in Barkerville of the waterwheel, which is, if you ask a lot of people, one of their favorite attractions to go see in Barkerville. He's also the contract holder for the Judges program. He's a fascinating character, and he has been an interpreter for over 30 years, playing Mr. Grimsby. It's incredible. He has a great story. It's just like Dave. It is short and sweet and to the point. And now, ladies and gentlemen, I give you Dave Brown. Hey, Dave, how's it going?
Good. Yeah. I got good things going on with the staff, and it's been a very smooth summer. No issues, no problems. It's
hey, smooth is good.
Yep.
Now you got a whole new crew with your Judges program. How is that going?
For two of them, it's their second year, and for one of them, it's his first year.
First year. Now, is he green as grass, or is he seasoning up nicely there in Barkerville?
He's well trained. He's a quick study. He got up to speed in no time at all. He's a little, if he's got a fault, he plays a clerk, so he can be young. No, he's fine. He's fine, yeah.
Right. Now, when I talk with people in this podcast, I like to open up with a story. And I'd like to tell you back when I was green as grass back in 2004, I was working at the schoolhouse. Now, we had to do all the duties of a schoolmaster in the 1800s. One of them was chopping wood. Now, I am, honest to say, I am horrible at chopping wood. I'm better now. I'm much better now. But at the time, I was pretty new to it all. And I would always chop my wood at the end of the day, just so nobody would watch, tourists, visitors, anyone wouldn't watch. And one time, I was chopping wood at the end of the day, and you stopped by and started to watch, and I got pretty intimidated. So I stopped and asked you a question about where the people find out when your shows are, and you went, oh, they just find that information up front. So then I sat there, and then I waited for you to leave, and then you sat down to watch. And I think I then just started to stack wood nervously, hoping that as soon you'd go away.
Yeah, I can't remember that at all. It's amazing what I don't remember anymore in my 60-plus years of age. But no, I don't remember that at all, man.
Where did you grow up, Dave?
I grew up in Winnipeg, Manitoba. Worked in northern Manitoba from the time I was 15 years old as a cook in archaeological camps. Worked for 3 years doing that. Worked as a surveyor for Manitoba Hydro, 60 kilometers from Hudson's Bay on the Nelson River, a hydroelectric project. I worked up there for about a year, made a pile of dough. Did whatever I wanted for about a year after that, and started working as a log builder. There was a friend of mine who started a small log building company in Saskatchewan. We had a contract in British Columbia.
Where were you located in British Columbia?
Yeah, I moved from Saskatchewan to BC. because of the big timber, because of the big wood. And I did that for about probably 30 years. And I was still doing it while I was working as an interpreter at Barkerville.
Now,
but
how did you hear about Barkerville?
I saw an ad. I was tree planting. I was already a seasoned log builder, but I was tree planting, and I read in a newspaper article that they were looking for log home restoration experts in Barkerville, British Columbia. And to me, that sounded so much better than tree planting. So I got a job, and I worked for about 3 years in Barkerville doing log home restoration before I ever got into the interpretation end of things.
What year was this when you started interpretation?
1981 through about 1983.
Was this in the same time you're living in the wild and awesome place of Cottonwood?
I did live in Cottonwood for a while, yeah. We had my partner had a small sawmill there and a log building operation that I'd work at in the wintertime.
So at this point, you've been in Barkerville for about 3 years. Is that when you showed interest in interpretation, or did somebody approach you? Did you, how did you make that whole process come together?
Oh, it was kind of, I worked log building in Barkerville, and then we'd quit work at 2 p.m, and I'd go snag falling on fires in the area till about 8 o'clock at night, and I just stopped waking up in the morning in time for work. So consequently, I was fired from. Well, I wasn't fired, but I didn't get the winter job with the maintenance crew. You know, Henry Martin said, "I really like you, Dave, but you haven't shown up for work decently in the last month. You're not on the winter crew." So I went logging that winter, and then in the springtime, there was a fellow who ran the waterwheel, and he got a much better job surveying, and I was just kind of picked to do it. It was just happenstance. And that was the old waterwheel that was near the El Dorado.
Which, when you're visiting today, that's right when you walk in through the front gates. How big was that waterwheel? It
was an exact replica of the existing waterwheel. Right. It was a 16-foot overshot waterwheel. And the 2 replicas they built after that were based entirely on its plan.
When you first started working in Barkerville, were you Mr. Grimsby then?
Yeah, I was. Yeah.
So that would have put it at 1984?
Oh, that'd be about 1985, somewhere in there, yeah.
I have to know. What was the environment? What was it like working in Barkerville in the 80s?
There was no admission fee. We'd fire up the water wheel, which was next to the parking lot, and we'd instantly have 100, 150 people watching what was then a demonstration of the wheel, not a real show. Right. And it was, I was young. Yeah. It was Barkerville. It was Wells. It was fabulous. I mean, I look at the young guys working for me now in their 20s, and I just look at the fun they're having, and I go, that was me,
Right. When you first started on the water wheel, did you have a crew of guys with you, or were you by yourself, or how did that work out?
We were government employees. Right. And there were contractors working alongside of us. And there was some friction between the unionized workers and the contractors.
When did you make the change from wanting to be a government employee to an actual contractor? Like, what made you turn around and go, you know what? I think I'm going to run this.
Well, everybody wants a job. Right. Nobody wants to be a boss. Nobody wants to run the show. But if it's the only way you can secure a job, then you bid on the contract and take on everything that's involved with it.
Who was your longest running employee?
Probably Mark Dawson.
How many seasons was he with you?
I have no idea. Maybe a dozen. JP's been with me almost 10 years now. Great. Lynette's been with me 9 years. The people working with me now, I consider, probably they're right up there with anybody who's worked with me. Right. Yeah, the first year I got the contract, it was a $16,000 contract. Me and one other individual were hired to run the waterwheel show for 2.5 months. I wrote the show, I directed the show, I made a video of the show. At the end of the season, I paid all my bills and I had nothing. But I had a show that has stuck with me for 27 years.
Well, I have to say is that whenever we come to Barkerville, and when I say we, I mean my family, my dad loves the waterwheel. We have to check out the waterwheel show. That's what he always says.
Yeah, we're big with the hillbillies.
Well, there's definitely appeal about it. I mean, it's a blue collar. It's something that works. It moves. I mean, it's a job.
Yeah. And I think, too, that everybody knows what a doctor does. Everybody knows what a lawyer does. But not everybody knows what an underground miner does, or how what his place of work looks like and how it goes about his work.
Have you ever done any mining yourself there, Dave?
Oh, yeah. I've done lots of mining exploration where you're in the bush doing soil sampling, and I worked underground for 2 years.
What kind of mine was that?
It was a gold mine in Wells, Mosquito Creek. An exploration project, and I wasn't a miner. I was a surveyor's helper. I collected samples. I did IP work, which is kind of test the conductivity of rock to determine whether there's gold-bearing ore in it. It was one of the most interesting jobs I've ever had, working underground. Every day is different. You go underground, you come out and it's snowing, or it's raining, or it's a moonlit night, or it's like being in a movie theater. You're completely absorbed with what you're doing. And then you come out into the world again 8 hours later, and it's different than when you left it.
What kind of shifts would you do? How long would you spend underground in a day?
You'd go underground. Sometimes go down for 4 or 5 hours.
Wow. And how many feet down were you going? Like, that's pretty impressive.
It wasn't deep. It was an adit, a tunnel into a mountain. So it's distance and length that, you'd go in a mile on a little locomotive.
Like steam powered?
Yeah,
or
little electric batteries. Yeah. Yeah.
So, Dave, I have to ask, when did you meet your lovely paramour, your wife, Veronica?
That would have been in 1990.
Was she involved in Barkerville, or was she just somebody you met? Or
she was a tourist. She wasn't a tourist. She's a Canadian-Swiss citizen. She was working in Victoria. A friend of hers came from Switzerland. They went on a vacation together, and they visited Barkerville. And I kind of stalked her after work, and that was that. We've kind of been together for 26 years.
Wow. Congratulations. Yeah. Now you have 2 daughters, Annika and Emily.
That's right.
And Annika right now is going to university, correct?
No, she's in her first year foundations program to be a heavy duty mechanic.
Good for her.
Yeah, and she's finished that. She's looking for a job. She's got, but she's a 20-year-old kid who's really squared away. I don't worry about her too much. She lives in Kamloops. She's in a couple of jazz bands. She's having fun.
I'm going to feel old here, but did Emily graduate from high school?
Emily graduated high school about a month ago.
Oh, she already graduated.
Yep. And she was with top marks for top academic award for any child in grade 12.
Big congrats to her.
Yeah, and she's going to UNBC this fall, science program.
Wow. Well, what was it like raising kids in the Barkerville setting? Did they pick on it pretty quick, or were they wondering why Dad was somebody else when he went to work?
It's something they've lived with all their life. They never knew any different. From the time they were born, I was Mr. Grimsby. So, and their acceptance into the town and comfort being in the town, I think that, I don't think that I think we're pretty good parents, but I think what makes my kids truly exceptional is their association with Barkerville and getting to know so many different people, going to work at 12 years old in the Lung Duck Tong, in a very busy restaurant, and coping with that when you're young. I think those are the things that I think really shaped them and really made them the strong characters that they are.
What I remember the most about them is that they're little entrepreneurs. They would go around with a shine box when they were younger, and they would follow people around and start offering to shine their shoes. And it was a great little business for them.
Yeah, see, what Emily used to do was follow the town tour and make a note of everybody with leather shoes on the tour. And then seek those people out and ask them if they'd like their shoe shined. When they asked her how much you want, she says, I do it for free. And nothing. And she'd always get more money than if she had asked for $1.
Now that sounds like somebody who's learned something from watching the waterwheel show. Did she get that idea from you?
Oh, no. Emily's, no, it's just something she picked up on her own. Yeah.
As I mentioned at the beginning, that you also took on the judge's contract. When did you take on that?
Dates are really something about the time Charlie and James were working the waterwheel with me. And Rod and Don left. And I bid on the judge's contract and had them up in Richfield working for me.
When I was talking with James, he said that it was 98.
98?
Yeah.
Okay, so that'd be almost 18 years of holding the judge's contract. Holy smokes. Yeah.
You mentioned in the beginning that you took on the waterwheel as a need. Did you have a passion for the judge's contract as well?
No, it's something Charlie and James really wanted to do. Charlie had previously worked the judge's contract with Peter Burgess. It's just something he knew how to do. He was one of the few people who really knew the script and knew the school program that was interested in doing the work. So it was almost by default, we picked up the judge's contract. Yeah.
Now, last week, I had on Stuart Kaywood. And Stuart Kaywood was roommates. And also Stuart worked for you in the judge's contract, but he was roommates with Tim Sutherland. And we lost Tim Sutherland last year. It was after he worked the school season for you. He portrayed Judge Begbie, I think it was for 14 seasons, I think it was.
It'd be, I was going to say 12, but it could be 14. Could be 14, I don't know. Yeah.
Was there any particular moment or story with Tim that really stands out for you? I know he worked with you for a few seasons. Yeah. Does he have any Timisms, I guess is what I'm asking.
It's one thing to be Tim's friend. It's another thing to be his employer. And he wasn't really difficult. He was brilliant at what he did, but he nonetheless was a bit of a tough talent to manage. And one thing I really feel good about is me, David, and Tim going out and getting pretty drunk together. I cooked supper. They got a bunch of gin and tonic. We had a great evening together. And we truly appreciated each other's company in a way that I hadn't done with Tim in a long time. And I'm really glad that happened.
So in all your years in Barkerville, storied career, still going, What is your favorite interpreter story? Whether it's something that made you go like, "This is pretty awesome," or something go, "Whoa, okay, that's a new one."
Oh, let me think. I guess it's when years ago, when I was working as a government employee interpreter, and there was an awful lot of pranking going on, and things weren't near as kind of serious as they are under the contractor's model. There was Billy Barker's shaft, and it was the one up in Chinatown, the shaft up in Chinatown. And Billy Barker was standing there, arms outstretched, legs spread, and with a shovel in his hand, and he just struck gold. And what we did was we got a big hunk of Cuba saw, hung it out of his fly. And then when the tour came along and they were talking about Billy Barker's shaft, the interpreter had his back to the display and was talking to the visitors, and they were all just laughing their heads off, and he couldn't figure out why. And that was one of, that was a lot of fun. Yeah, that was a lot of
fun. Oh man. Well, Dave, before we call it a day here, would you be able to walk people through like a day in your programming? Tell them what you do during the course of the day.
Yeah, I'll explain to you about the variety of presentations. Yeah, it starts the day with the Amazing Tales of Golden Trails, which was formerly known as the Goldfields Discourse. It happens at 9 a.m. It's the first and only interpreter program offered in Barkerville in that time slot. And it's just an overview of the Cariboo Gold Rush and it explains how the miners followed the geological indicators into this remote area of Cariboo. Some of the big strikes on Antler Creek, Williams Creek, and the significance of Barkerville and the goldfields. The next presentation is the Waterwheel Show, which is an investment rally. The reason we're explaining how the waterwheel works and how the mining is done is to entice investment dollars out of the public, and it's about a 45-minute presentation. It's a comedy. It's lots of laughs. It's a lot of fun. The next presentation is the Windlass Shaft Show, and it just explains how mining in Barkerville has changed from 1862, at a time when it was just hand mining up in Richfield, using a windlass here in Barkerville to recover gold, and then how in 8 short years there were projects that involved pumping 1,600 gallons of water a minute, 4 water wheels on a single property, 2 steam-powered pumps, a submersible steam-powered pump, and just how quickly the things changed in Barkerville and how the technology came to this area. And the next presentation after that is Cariboo Goldfields Limited, which is the explanation of a hydraulic elevator, how a giant suction dredge operated at the turn of the century. And it's the 2003 annual general meeting of Cariboo Goldfields Limited. And we explained to the shareholders how basically we squandered their money on all kinds of ridiculous state-of-the-art gadgets that accomplish nothing in the way of recovering gold. And at the end of the presentation, what does any promoter do? We ask them for more money. When they say no, we say, well, take your dividend check and, contact our London office regarding your dividend check, because we're liquidating all physical assets of the company and selling the property. And they're fun shows, later in the day, it's like these shows only run 20 minutes. And the visitors appreciate that because they've had a lot of 3-course meals before they get to us. Yeah.
And how does it look for your early justice program, your judges?
Yeah. The judges program is a Berry versus Blessing trial. It's a recreation of the trial of James Barry for the murder of Charles Blessing. It involves evidence, it involves witnesses, and it involves a jury. And it's a trial. Whereas the previous program was just kind of a bunch of old farts reminiscing, this is more courtroom business. And it's quite well received. Come up and have a look at things.
Thank you very much for sitting down with me, Dave. Have yourself a great day.
Yeah, you too, Matt. Bye-bye.
More here to come here at History Town. However, first, here's a word from our sponsor.
So, if you lived in the 1870s and had the misfortune of being caught committing a crime in Barkerville right after the judge had left town, you could rest secure in the knowledge that you would be languishing in jail until the judge returned the following year. And your trial would happen in one day. Swift justice. Visit Barkerville.
For more information, visit barkerville.ca. Barkerville, a National Historic Site of Canada.
Here on History Town, we discuss many personal stories. However, sometimes we do have discussions from the past. Well, Dave Brown was discussing about a famous trial that took place here in the Cariboo. Now, whenever people go to the courthouse, the first thing they ask is, any hangings today? Well, there was actually 2 historical noted hangings in Barkerville. Now, luckily, I am friends, and one of my co-creators of History Town, James Douglas, also was working in that early justice program for Dave Brown, as we noted in the podcast, and he and Charles Ross discovered some interesting facts about that trial. The one I'm discussing is a famous one, and it's notorious, and many articles have been written about it. It was of the murder of Charles Morgan Blessing by a man by the name of James Barry. And speaking of another James, however, a less notorious one, I have James Douglas here to discuss some facts about this trial. Good morning, James.
Good morning, Matt. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. James, you contacted me right away when you heard, as I always send you, the mix of the interview, and you said, I have some interesting facts about the early justice program, and specifically relating to the Charles Morgan Blessing. Would you be able to elaborate on that for us?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So as you talked about with Dave, Charles Ross and I and Dave bid on the judge's contract, or the early justice program, as we call it, after having worked for Dave for a few years. So I started working for Dave Brown in 1998. And in 2001, he, Charles Ross, and myself took over the management of the Richfield Courthouse. And one of the cases that I was the most fascinated by, and of course it makes sense because it's probably the most famous capital crime that was ever tried on Williams Creek in the history of the Richfield Courthouse. And that was a trial that took place, believe it or not, on July the 1st of 1867. So the date of Canadian Confederation. It's still a regular day in British Columbia. We don't join Confederation until 1871. But on July 1st, 1867, the case Regina versus James Barry was tried at the Richfield Courthouse. Now, I should just preface that by saying Regina means the Queen.
I was just about to ask,
so,
yes.
Right. So we always refer to it as Barry versus Blessing, but in actual parlance, it's Regina versus James Barry. And the details of that case are infamous here in Barkerville. And it goes back, I need to take you back to 1866. And that's when the local barber in Barkerville, a fellow by the name of Wellington Delaney Moses, who was an African-American who'd come up into British Columbia in the early 1860s, likely 1862, as part of an emigration plan that was put in by James Douglas, the governor of British Columbia, or ultimately the governor of British Columbia at that time. He brought a number of black families up who were facing persecution through the onset of the Civil War in the United States. So Wellington Delaney Moses was one of that early settling force that came up from the United States. He eventually made his way to Barkerville and opened up a barber shop, which was also a sort of fancy goods and stationery shop. And in 1866, Moses was returning to Barkerville, and along the route from Yale to Quesnelmouth, which was the mouth of the Quesnel River, what we called Quesnel, BC, at the time, he struck up a friendship on the road with a fellow named Charles Morgan Blessing. They mostly referred to him as Morgan Blessing, but his Christian name was Charles. He was from Iowa originally. No, forgive me. He was from Ohio originally. And Charles Morgan Blessing and Wellington Delaney Moses, and their 3 names each, made good friends on the trip from Yale to Quesnelmouth. And a little bit further on in the journey, as they were getting closer to Quesnel, they met up with an American gambler, as he was described, by the name of James Barry. And the 3 of them struck up an unlikely friendship, but they knew that they wanted to travel with partners. So the 3 of them made it to Quesnelmouth together. This is in the spring, probably really early spring of 1866. And when they got to Quesnelmouth, they were sort of sat there for a day, I presume, and sort of made their remaining travel plans. Wellington Delaney Moses had some business to take care of in the Quesnelmouth area, so he stayed behind a day or two. And Morgan Blessing and James Barry continued on the wagon road to, well, it was just the newly finished wagon road at that time. They continued on toward Barkerville. So the idea is that the first night they likely would have stayed at Cottonwood House, and then they would have pushed on to another settlement that doesn't exist anymore, which was called Van Winkle. So right now, the way that you get to Barkerville is that you come through, you pass the Stanley Road, you go to the town of Wells, which was developed in the 1930s, and then on to Barkerville from there. But the original Cariboo Wagon Road actually turned right off of what is now the modern highway at the Stanley Road. It went through Lightning Creek, which was the community where Stanley now is. And then it went up over the hills to Van Winkle, and then from Van Winkle, it went north through Richfield and then to Barkerville. Had Wells existed, you would have continued on to Wells from there. So where we enter Barkerville these days is actually the reverse of where they did back in the 1870s and 60s. So in 1866, a couple of days after he has let them go on ahead, Wellington Delaney Moses goes on to Cottonwood House, discovers that his friends had been there the day or two previous, then continues on to Van Winkle. And when he gets to Van Winkle, he discovers that nobody matching those descriptions had shown up. Perhaps somebody matching Barry's description was in Van Winkle. He eventually gets to Barkerville and cannot find Charles Morgan Blessing anywhere. At first, I don't know whether he was suspicious or not, but obviously he starts to become suspicious that something happened to his friend. So he starts to really search hard for him, cannot find him. He does hear word of James Barry frequenting a number of the dance halls and saloons in Barkerville, and apparently flashing around some money that Moses knew he didn't have when they had originally met him between Yale and Quesnelmouth. And he knew that Morgan Blessing did have a little bit of money that he'd brought up with him from the States. So Wellington Delaney Moses starts to suspect that perhaps his friend Blessing has met some foul play at the hands of James Barry. So he sort of takes it upon himself to become a citizen investigator, I suppose, and looks for clues. And ultimately, they do find a hurdy-gurdy dancing girl who was one of the dancing girls in one of the saloons, so-called a hurdy-gurdy because of the music that they danced to in particular. And she had with her a gold nugget stick pin that Moses recognized as having belonged to Charles Morgan Blessing. And the way he recognized it was very particular. Blessing had showed it to him previously. And apparently when you put it in your lapel, the stick pin, just the normal way that you would wear it, it didn't really look all that remarkable. But when you took it out and turned the gold pin over, the gold nugget itself was the exact replica of the profile of a man's face. So it was very recognizable. In fact, during the trial, Judge Begbie sketched the gold nugget in his bench book so that he would have a visual record of it, which, by the way, you can see. If you're ever in Victoria, call ahead to the BC Archives, and they have all of the surviving bench books from Judge Begbie's trial, and you can actually look at this recording that he made of the gold nugget stick pin, as well as his very particular shorthand that Begbie was known to practice a particular type of shorthand that let him write notes very quickly in his bench book during a trial.
That's incredible.
He wanted to have his own. He wanted to have his own record of what was happening. So this gold nugget stick pin seemed to be the smoking gun, because where did this hurdy-gurdy dancing girl get it? She said she got it from James Barrie. When questioned about it, Barrie insisted that Blessing had given it to him as a gift because his feet had been sore along the way. So once they left Cottonwood House, Barrie was said to have carried Blessing's pack. And as a means of showing him gratitude, Blessing had given him this gold nugget stick pin. Barrie then said that Blessing's feet got too sore, so he left him on the road around Pine Grove House before traveling on to Barkerville himself. So Moses was convinced that Barrie had actually murdered his friend, or something like that had happened. He went to the local constabulary, who basically said that maybe this is true. I mean, I'm totally paraphrasing a bunch of historical notes here, but maybe this was true. But since there was no actual body that had been discovered, there was very little that they thought that they could do at that time. Lo and behold, a couple of months later, some human remains were found just outside of Pine Grove House, which, for our listeners, is where Troll Ski Resort is today. And not only was this decomposing body, obviously it had been shot in the back of the head with what was likely a pistol, but it also had a number of personal effects with it. So a backpack that had a drinking cup in it, some tin plates, some other utensils, a lot of which was monogrammed with the initials CMB. Charles Morgan Blessing. So the jig was up. People realized that Blessing had been murdered. Barrie was the most obvious suspect. So once word hit Barkerville that the constables were going to be looking for James Barrie, he booked passage on the next Barnard's Express stagecoach to head out of town. So he gets away from the police before they have an opportunity to arrest him. Now, this is where things get very interesting because, you see, one of the constables, I think his name was Sullivan, one of the constables who was living and working, it was a volunteer constabulary here in Barkerville, remembered that very recently, in the spring of 1866, there had been a telegraph that was installed all the way from Yale to Soda Creek, and Soda Creek is just north of Williams Lake. Now, keep in mind, the telegraph was invented in 1865. This is 1866, right. And already they have a telegraph between Yale and Soda Creek that's newly installed. So this man, Sullivan, thinks, all right, I know what I have to do. He gets on a horse and rides all night to Soda Creek. Over 100 miles in the dead of night on horseback. He's riding as fast as he can. He gets to the telegraph station at Soda Creek and wires the constables in Yale a description of what James Barrie looks like and the crime that he's been accused of. So that when James Barrie actually arrives in Yale, gets off the stagecoach thinking he's a free man, he's immediately arrested by the constables at Yale for the crime of murder. And get this, as far as we know, this is the first time in the history of the entire world that a telegraph device was used as a tool in a murder investigation.
Wow.
So we've got a little CSI Caribou going on right here. And it does. It works. It brings Barrie back to Barkerville and Richfield, where he waits to stand trial. And on July 1st, 1867, he is tried for murder and convicted. And although most of the evidence is circumstantial, there was no photographic evidence of him committing the murder, Judge Begbie was heard to say that he believed that James Barrie committed the murder as if he had seen him do it himself, and pronounced the sentence of death. And on August 17th of 1867, both James Barrie and a First Nations fellow called Nickel Pulsk, who had been convicted of the murder of a number of white miners in a territorial dispute, they were both executed that day. And it was the only two executions that ever took place in the history of Williams Creek while we were a British colony. which is pretty remarkable when you consider, what kind of a metropolitan place Barkerville was, and how lawless other gold rushes had been. But this was really the only two instances of a capital crime being tried, the victim, or the perpetrators found guilty and then executed. And the other thing, because as you mentioned earlier, people do ask us all the time, especially when they get all the way up to Richfield, like what happened here, what executions took place, who murdered whom. So it's really interesting to be able to tell that story and show people how relatively lawful the society was. But the other thing they always want to know is about the hanging tree, right? Like where was it that this took place? And I understand people's fascination by that kind of thing. And it's a great opportunity for us to teach people a little bit about British law, because you hear rumors of the hanging trees all over British Columbia. And certainly people may have been hanged from trees at some point, but that would have been a lynch mob sort of situation. In the British statutes at that time, the law actually said that no permanent place of public execution could ever be seen in the colony. So you could have something in a penitentiary that was a permanent place of execution, but in a place like Richfield, what happened was on the date of execution, a scaffold was erected. The executions took place. Then the scaffold was dismantled and all evidence of it burned.
Wow.
So that you couldn't actually have any lasting legacy of the deeds that had occurred there. So it wasn't a situation, although the justice was rather swift. Your trial did last about a day. It wasn't like once you'd been found guilty, they just hauled you outside and strung you up from the nearest tree. There were several weeks that took place between the date of the original trial and the date of execution, and then very official proceedings took place. After the executions on that day in August of 1867 took place, the bodies were then brought down and interred outside of the Richfield Cemetery in unhallowed ground, as was the custom at that time for convicted murderers. And as far as we know, those unmarked graves are still there today.
That's amazing. Well, I knew about 70% of that. Like I just from, reading, but I didn't know about the telegraph. Like I say, this episode, we're recording this at like Wednesday at 8 a.m. Usually this is our final hour of production and we're sort of editing through, but I really appreciate it. I was happy to stop the presses when you told me that you had a great story, and I was not disappointed. That was amazing. Well,
my absolute pleasure. Thanks, Matt.
Thank you, and have yourself a great day in Barkerville. History Town was made possible by the hard work, determination, and man-hours of James Douglas and Dirk Van Stralen. Also, History Town has a special thank you for Debbie and Cyril Quick, and also my lovely wife, Genevieve Quick. I'd also like to thank my guest for the day.
Yeah, this is Dave Brown. I manage the mining interpretation and early justice and Begbie programs for Barkerville, British Columbia. Thanks so much for listening to me. Hope you got something out of it. Bye-bye.
Well, folks, that's it for me here on History Town. I really want to thank Dave Brown and James Douglas for being on the show. And next week, I have on Michelle Lafertz. She is a historical interpreter in Barkerville Town and Park. I am excited to talk with her, and I'm even more excited because I don't know her. I have only met her once. James Douglas was telling me about all the wonderful work she does with Danette and Stuart there on the street, and I said, let's sign her up. Now, this is a jam-packed episode. This episode also contained a lot of editing work, and I am now located in Penticton. It is plus 33 degrees here in my office. I am basically in my shorts, sweating in my sweatbox to bring to you. So I am going to play a special song for you today, folks. It's from the boys at Joe Denny Saloon. It's called Hard Times Come Again No More. This is your old friend Matthew Quick saying good day.
Let us pause in life's pleasures and count its many tears, while we all sob sorrow with the poor. There's a song that will linger forever in our ears. Oh, hard times come again no more. 'Tis the song, the sigh of the weary. Hard times come again no more. Many days you have lingered around my cabin door. Oh, hard times come again no more. While we seek mirth and beauty and music light and gay, there are frail forms fainting at the door. Though their voices are silent, their pleading looks still say, oh, hard times come again no more. 'Tis the song, the sigh of the weary. Hard times come again no more. Many days you have lingered around my cabin door. Oh, hard times come again no more. There's a pale, drooping maiden who toils her life away with the worn heart whose better days are o'er. Though her voice would be merry, 'tis sighing all the day. Oh, hard times come again no more. 'Tis the song, the sigh of the weary. Hard times come again no more. Many days you have lingered around my cabin door. Oh, hard times come again no more. 'Tis a sigh that is wafted across the troubled wave. 'Tis a wail that is heard upon the shore. 'Tis a dirge that is murmured around the lowly grave. Oh, hard times come again no more. 'Tis the song, the sigh of the weary. Hard times come again no more. Many days you have lingered around my cabin door. Oh, hard times come again no more. 'Tis the song, the song